The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Sopranos make mafia life seem dangerously glamorous. But in reality, the day-to-day operations of the mob are often much duller than what we see on screen. Work can be surprisingly laborious, money can be scarce, and it's almost impossible to move up in the ranks. Today, we're taking a look at what it's really like to be in the mafia. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and leave us a comment to let us know what other true crime stories you would like to hear about. Okay, time to analyze this. Hey, they can't all be Godfather references. If you've ever watched a Scorsese movie, you're probably familiar with the golden age of the mob, which began around the 1920s and lasted through the 1970s. Former made men say that while organized crime does still exist, being in the business is nothing like it used to be. Whether you're sitting at a desk job talking real estate, managing a construction site, or running a money laundering restaurant, it's a far cry from the extortion, shakedowns, and shootouts of decades past. You know, the good old days. And while many mafioso also cite the golden age as a time of honor and loyalty, they argue that those times no longer exist. Now, everyone breaks the rules. Yeah, that's right. The mob has a strict set of rules, like a country club with guns. First, you have to be a full-blooded Italian to join the gang, which, yeah, everyone knows that. John Panizzi, formerly of the Lucchese crime family, shared that mobsters aren't allowed to whack women and children, but they also can't be intentionally involved in lawsuits or even invest in the stock market. Imagine getting rolled up in a carpet for investing in Amazon. Because the mafia was notorious for using explosive devices in Italy, mob soldiers were banned from using them in the US. But that didn't stop them from placing a bomb underneath Gambino underboss Frankie DeCicco's car in 1986. And despite observing a strict policy against drug dealing at the time, each of the 5 families has had at least one member tied to a drug-related business. The enterprise brings in too much money to prevent guys from dabbling. Remember in Goodfellas when Paulie tells Henry not to get involved in drugs because of the heavy prison sentences associated with them, and he does it anyway because it's just too much cash? Yeah, it's like that. Yeah, that was a good movie.
Hey there, weird historians! This video is sponsored by Mondly, offering a limited time 65% off lifetime access to 41 languages using our link, mondly.app/weirdhistory. Has studying weird history from around the world ever left you wanting to learn another language? Mondly is the time machine co-pilot you need. The app has access to 41 foreign languages from 33 native languages, creating over 1,000 different language combinations. If your native language is Catalan and you'd really like to learn Farsi, you don't know what I'm saying. But also, Mondly has got you covered. Learn via daily lessons recorded by fluent speakers to ensure proper pronunciation, then test your knowledge with weekly and monthly quizzes to review and recap what you've learned. Best of all, you can learn on your own time with real-time feedback provided by the speech recognition chatbot to help quickly improve your pronunciation without the need to wait for a human teacher. Get lifetime access to all languages for 65% off by visiting mondly.app/weirdhistory or following the link in the description. Thanks again to Mondly for sponsoring this video.
Roles in the mafia are highly specialized to ensure that no one person ever knows the full spectrum of a family's criminal enterprise. As a teen, you'll most likely drive other made men around as they do their business. Imagine getting excited for your first day in the mob only to realize you're a wise guy Uber. Entire families of blood relatives often join the syndicate under a particular profession, such as assassins or bodyguards. Or drivers, I guess. Capos, or captains, are often defined as the leaders of specific criminal activities in a detailed location. For instance, one capo may be in charge of everything west of a particular neighborhood block, while another would be in charge of illegal gambling. Suppose you're not officially inducted and are just an associate, or worse, a seasonal employee. Geez, might as well go work at the mall. In that case, you'll most likely remain in whatever position you had as a civilian, because that's the role that determined your usefulness to the family. These roles include, but are not limited to, bookkeepers, drug dealers, politicians, and law enforcement. When you're in the mob, La Familia takes priority over your actual familia. Women are rarely recruited into the business, and children from families with mafia ties usually recall later that they rarely saw their fathers. Instead of showing up for family picnics, Little League games, or other family-related events, made men show their affection by giving their loved ones expensive gifts. Sometimes buying their love worked, but those kids who want a life outside of organized crime often resent that they grew up without their fathers around. Former made man Frankie DiMatteo, whose father and grandfather were involved in the Colombo Mafia, recalled what it was like growing up. By 10, you notice your uncles are a lot different from other people. They're whispering, and then there are people coming around and they dress differently than other families. By 12 or 13, I knew who everybody was. Speaking of kids, it's not uncommon for children to witness violence at a young age. Like the son of mobster Giuseppe DiCicco, who discovered the bodies of his 2 uncles when he was 11 years old, after hearing the gunshots that suddenly ended their lives. When the mafia decides you're done, no matter how many of your nephews are around to see it. As bad as it was being the kid of a mafia man, it was just as tough being the wife of one. And we don't just mean Carmela Soprano constantly wondering whether Tony was cheating on her. Some women who have tried to leave their mobster husbands have become victims of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse, kidnapping, and even murder. Consequently, it's not unheard of for former mob wives to go into hiding, or even take their own lives. The mafia runs on funds, and those funds don't always come easily. Just because you're raking in the dough for the family business doesn't mean the organized crime hustle will make you rich. Most of the money goes back into the organization to pay off high-interest loans. And the work you do isn't quite as exciting as what you see in the movies. Wise guys are on call 24/7, and they don't get their paychecks automatically deposited in a bank account like a Best Buy employee. You get paid when the Don decides the job is finished. And while you can't expect to be paid for the overtime, you can expect to get your kneecaps tapped if you sit too close to a made man's wife during a job. Even though organized crime does have a documented connection with labor unions, wise guys can't exactly unionize. Because the mob hierarchy is specifically designed to keep bosses out of prison, most members have specific mundane jobs that keep them from gaining too much information about the organization. Bosses expect bodyguards to be available at all times to protect their families, and can be called at a moment's notice. If you're a family associate, expect to do a lot of manual labor, which makes the 24-hour dress code seem all the more unreasonable. Don't worry though, you'll more likely be required to unload trucks than dispose of bodies. Although extortion, prostitution, and drug rings compromise some of the mob's income, they need bigger jobs to keep the cash flow steady and out of the public eye. Hijacking big rigs full of clothes and stereo equipment was one of notorious crime boss John Gotti's favorite ways to make a quick buck in his early days. However, these weren't Fast and Furious heists, or even Butch and Sundance heists. Mafioso would simply bribe truck drivers to misplace crates of goods for their associates to pick up later. That means if you're a low-level associate, much of your day-to-day is going to be backbreaking work loading and unloading contraband, like heavy jukeboxes and hundreds of cases of cigarettes. Frankly, at this point, prison isn't looking so bad. When you're in the mob, expect to follow a strict dress code. The type and style of clothing varies depending on which family you belong to, but you should always dress to impress, because if you don't look good, businessmen won't take you seriously. According to mob survivor Frank DiMatteo, there were 2 acceptable styles: a shirt and tie, or button-down knit shirts and sweaters for when you were in the club in the daytime. And never sneakers. No word on velour tracksuits. Well, at least when you get pinched doing all that waste management, you can relax your style, right? Wrong. Turns out you're expected to dress the part of a good fella even if you end up in prison. For instance, the Sagaria family wears Samsonite shoes with cashmere socks and designer clothes, even when locked in the slammer. Meanwhile, the Schiavone group requires its members to maintain impeccable grooming standards, with well-trimmed beards and absolutely no hair gel. But good news, tattoos are A-OK. What about a tattoo of a sneaker? Better not push your luck. Conducting all of your mafia business securely requires a surprising amount of tax forms and paperwork. After all, remember what happened to Al Capone. You can't just stash your money in a regular bank account. Instead, you need to launder it, which can get tedious. Bars that don't do well are the perfect place to hide extra income because they deal with a lot of cash. So the money can move quietly through mob hands while the business makes relatively small tax contributions. Still, gangsters need a bunch of these shells in order to ensure the operation's success, meaning that each dive bar requires its own tax return. The more successful your underground business is, the more paperwork you'll have to complete for all your business fronts. Sounds like it's time to make H&R Block an offer they can't refuse. If you join one of the 5 families in the hopes of eventually becoming Don Corleone, it's unlikely you'll ever reach your career goals. Each gang in the mafia is considered a family, and each family has roughly between 10 and 100 members. Each association has only one boss, followed by the underboss. Next in line come the captains, followed by the made men. Everyone else who works for the family is called an associate, and there is a big hierarchical gap between them and the rest of the crew. Dons must approve new family branches, and new groups are rare. The boss makes all the decisions for the entire syndicate and, just like any other manager, also benefits from receiving most of the family income. Some underbosses occasionally make decisions without consulting their don, but the power they hold varies. Often the underboss serves as an apprentice in case his don gets too old to conduct meetings, is sentenced to prison, or gets sent to sleep with the fishes. They're like the vice president. Capos lead their own sections of the family and are often stationed in a specific geographic location. Soldiers conduct most of the dirty work and are considered the family's bottom members. Dons also employ associates, but they aren't made men and are usually just experienced robbers or dirty politicians. And because each person holds a specific job, moving up in the family ranks is rare. That's a real bulletproof glass ceiling. While Hollywood definitely takes liberties when creating mafia stories, some former wise guys claim that certain details of mob life are so accurate, the writers must have worked with made guys as consultants. And just like any other business arrangement, Hollywood and the mob share a mutually beneficial relationship. As classic films like The Godfather, Casino, and Goodfellas create intrigue and appeal for broader audiences, some mafioso have been able to capitalize on the mystique by sharing their experiences in the media. For example, recently, Sammy the Bull Gravano and Joe Panizzi both contributed to podcasts detailing their lives as gangsters, which is further proof that no one can resist telling their life story on a podcast. Knowing that his defeat and capture was inevitable, Adolf Hitler took his own life in a subterranean Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. His demise triggered a ripple effect of consequences that would leave Germany in disarray and his supporters scrambling to escape justice. So, today we're going to take a look at what actually happened after the death of Adolf Hitler. Okay, time to take your front row seats for the fall of the Third Reich. Right before Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun offed themselves on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler told aide Martin Bormann that he and Eva were to be cremated as quickly as possible so their bodies could never be displayed by the victorious Allies. Like 10-point bucks on the hood of a pickup. For the group of officers who were charged with destroying his body, however, a simple logistical detail quickly became a major problem. They couldn't find any gasoline to ignite the Fuhrer. It was like that Alanis Morissette song. And to complicate matters, the Russians were so close to the bunker that attempting to fetch the fuel elsewhere in Berlin was impossible. The only option was to siphon gas from damaged vehicles in the bunker's underground garage, which were covered in collapsed concrete and masonry. Approximately 200 liters were quickly extracted and placed near the entrance to the bunker. That seems like plenty, but apparently it wasn't. Hitler's chauffeur, Erich Kempka, and adjutants Otto Gunsche and Hans Linge placed Hitler's and Braun's bodies in the courtyard while Russian shells landed in the area, throwing up columns of dust and soil. The three poured gasoline over both bodies and ignited the pyre with a gasoline-doused rag, under the watchful eye of Bormann and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. But when the fuel was consumed, the bodies were still not completely destroyed, so the group repeated the process for the rest of the afternoon, finding and dumping hundreds more gallons of gasoline on the Fuhrer and Eva. The charred remains of the bodies and those of Hitler's two dogs were then buried in a shallow trench beside the bunker. Apparently, Hitler couldn't stand the thoughts of his pets being adopted by the Allies. When Hitler took himself out, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, had already determined that they would not only off themselves, but also do away with their 6 young children. Magda was especially determined to make sure her children didn't survive, believing they would suffer a life of scorn and ridicule. She coerced an SS medical officer with a background in dentistry, Helmut Kunz, to assist with her scheme. Kunz initially refused and even fled the bunker to avoid the horrible task, but Magda threatened to tell her husband of his desertion. Kunz returned, and on the night of May 1st, 1945, as the children prepared for bed, Magda ordered Kunz to give them an injection of morphine to knock them out. While they were unconscious, each child was force-fed cyanide capsules. A few minutes later, Joseph and Magda went into the garden of the Chancellery, accompanied by Goebbels' SS adjutant, Gunther Schwagermann, where they offed themselves with Schwagermann's help. A good manager knows when to delegate. Many of the same people who followed Hitler into life followed him out of it as well. The mayor of Leipzig, his wife, and many other city officials threw a party in the town hall that they capped off by drinking poison. In Demmin, 1,000 civilians took their lives in less than 72 hours leading up to the capture of the town by Russian invaders, specifically to avoid falling into Soviet hands. Ernst Robert Grawitz, a doctor involved in concentration camp extermination, sat down with his family at the dinner table and detonated 2 grenades. Across Germany, thousands of people, either ardent supporters who couldn't bear the idea of defeat, or individuals culpable of horrific crimes, chose oblivion rather than capture or escape. With the smell of defeat in the air, various German officials spent the final days of the Third Reich attempting to improve their own political stature, or desperately bargain with the Allies to avoid punishment after the war. Hitler, obviously, wasn't too happy about the situation, and when he heard of the perceived treacheries of Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, both of whom fled Berlin after Adolf's birthday party, he immediately rewrote his last political will and testament to reflect his contempt and anger over these developments. Petty, yeah, but it was his party. He can cry if he wants to. Surprisingly, once Hitler was gone, this left the completely apolitical admiral and U-boat commander Karl Donitz as the new president of the Reich, for a few days at least anyway. When Stalin, a man not known for sugarcoating his thoughts, heard of Hitler's demise, he purportedly said, "So the bastard's dead. Too bad we didn't capture him alive." You don't often hear this, but Stalin had a point. However, the man with the iron stash wanted absolute proof of his rival's demise. So he ordered elements of the elite Soviet investigation unit, known as SMERSH, to find tangible verification of Hitler's passing. SMERSH. All the good acronyms must have been taken. On May 2nd, SMERSH operatives sealed off the Chancellery Garden and bunker area and began a systematic search of the grounds. After 3 days, a Russian officer dug up the remains of Hitler and Eva. But thanks to all the hijinks with the gasoline, their remains were unrecognizable. They were moved to a secret location where Hitler was identified via dental records. How did they get those dental records? Well, the SMERSH unit found Hitler's dentist's office, only to find the dentist himself had fled successfully to the west. They detained the dentist's assistant, Kata Hausermann, who described Hitler's teeth, which were distinctively bad as a result of the Führer's love of cake and sweets, and produced the Führer's dental x-rays. Stalin showed his gratitude by sentencing her to 10 years in a Soviet labor camp. Thanks, Uncle Joe. What was left of the German government took a day to publicly announce Hitler's passing. Broadcasting on the Reichssender Hamburg, the last shortwave radio station in Germany-controlled territory in Hamburg, the announcement was preceded by the somber music of Wagner and Bruckner, because Candle in the Wind hadn't been recorded yet. The report itself was a bit fanciful, claiming that Hitler died fighting till his last breath against Bolshevism. The new leader of the government, Admiral Karl Donitz, then presented a lengthy oration praising Hitler's heroic demise, leaving out the factual details, and imploring the German people to fight against the annihilation by the advancing Bolshevist enemy. The decision to postpone inevitable surrender prolonged the fighting until May 8th, a week later. News of Hitler's dirt nap was officially received around the world. The BBC broadcast news of the Donitz announcement, but also cautioned that it could be propaganda designed to help Hitler escape. The front page of the Daily Express newspaper printed the headline, "Hitler is dead," but pointedly refused to publish an obituary, saying instead, "It prints today every line of information about the manner of his death. It wastes no inch of space upon his career. The evil of his deeds is all too well known." Despite the confusion, it was generally accepted by the public that Hitler was gone. It wasn't until May 2, 1945, that President Harry Truman addressed Hitler's demise in a less than official manner during a news conference. A reporter asked whether the U.S. official knew Hitler was out of the picture, and Truman responded with a succinct yes. While Truman admitted they didn't know yet how Hitler had passed, he insisted that they had it on the best authority possible that the dictator was pushing daisies. Truman refused to reveal who that authority was, but we can be pretty sure it wasn't Stalin. Although Stalin privately knew the truth and accepted Hitler's end, he never announced it publicly. Instead, he preferred to promote various rumors about Hitler's escape to Argentina, Spain, or elsewhere in the world. Some believe he used this strategy to support his own political agenda of maintaining tension amongst other world powers. Whatever the reason, Stalin steadfastly denied that Hitler was dead when he met Truman personally at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Although we can't rule out whether Stalin taunted the president with a smug rendition of "I know something you don't know." Although Hitler wished to fight to the end, in late 1945, Heinrich Himmler acknowledged to his contact within the Swedish government, Count Folke Bernadotte, that the war was lost. Himmler wished to minimize further casualties, secretly hoping Bernadotte could facilitate a successful negotiation with the West. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were saved, but for Himmler, it did no good. The Allies insisted on an unconditional surrender. Even worse for Himmler, in the last week of Hitler's life, Western radio was reporting news of his secret negotiations, which was pretty awkward. An enraged Hitler removed Himmler from all government posts, expelled him from the party, and ordered his arrest. By then, Himmler had implemented his final desperate plan, attempting to blend into the masses of unidentified German soldiers fleeing to the west. He shaved off his mustache, put on an eye patch, removed his glasses, and headed for the British zone in northern Germany. But his cunning pirate disguise did not work, and he was detained at a roadblock. Rather than be captured, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule and took himself out. When Hermann Goering heard reports that Hitler planned to literally bite the bullet, he sent a telegram to the Führer, inquiring whether or not this now meant Goering should officially assume leadership of the government, as per a 1941 decree. Hitler didn't take this well. Already enraged by the treachery of Himmler, Hitler similarly demanded Goering resign all party posts or face arrest and execution. Goering complied, but Hitler ordered his arrest anyway. There is just no pleasing some people. Goering was briefly detained, but after hurriedly contacting Allied forces in the region, he offered to surrender. Goering was placed on trial at Nuremberg, where he was convicted of war crimes and managed to take his own life moments before his scheduled execution. Within Berlin, many units continued to fight after Hitler's demise. These troops were mostly teenage boys and older men, impressed into the militia and charged with stopping the Russian capture of their capital. Desertion from these units was punishable by death. A lot of that going around. Even as the Russians encircled the city, German forces of the 12th Army, under Walter Wenck, were ordered to stop fighting Americans on the Western Front and return to Berlin by fighting through enemy lines. This was done to allow as many civilians and soldiers as possible to make their way to Western lines controlled by the US and Britain. No one wanted to be in territory controlled by the Russians. Remember what happened to that dental assistant? Although Wenck failed to infiltrate Russian lines, his actions are believed to have allowed for the westward escape of thousands of German civilians. On May 7, 1945, Time magazine released a stark cover consisting of Hitler's face with a giant red X over it. He was the first to receive this dubious honor, but not the last. The dropping of the atomic bombs, the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the slayings of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden all got the X treatment. Of course, Time magazine had previously named Hitler their Man of the Year in 1938. And while the distinction was meant to highlight the greatest threatening force that the democratic, freedom-loving world faces today, the decision remains controversial, which is probably why they went for the big red X the next time he made the cover. On July 10, 1981, Ken Rex McElroy was murdered in Skidmore, Missouri, in one of the most bizarre cases authorities had ever encountered. There were dozens of witnesses to the crime, which occurred in broad daylight. It should have been an easy case to crack, but everyone in the town clammed up, and even today, police still don't know exactly who ended McElroy's life. Today, we're going to take a look at how an entire community made a vigilante pact to kill the town bully and kept it quiet for 30 years. Time to find out how an entire town banded together to kick Ken Rex McElroy off the planet, like the bad guy at the end of Roadhouse. Ken Rex McElroy was born in 1934 to a family of poor migrant farmers. By the age of 15, he had dropped out of high school and begun to make a name for himself as a top-tier son of a bitch. He was a cattle rustler and small-time thief, and over the years he was suspected of stealing just about everything, including alcohol, gasoline, grain, livestock, and even antiques. You steal my grain? Okay. You steal my antiques? You son of a bitch. Despite the frequent accusations, McElroy was able to avoid convictions with the help of good old-fashioned hoodlum intimidation. More on that in a minute. Speaking of stealing things, McElroy met his future wife, Trenna McLeod, when she was just 12 years old, and he was more than 20 years her senior. McElroy's courtship consisted of routinely following her school bus, honking and yelling at the driver until the bus pulled over and allowed him to abscond with her. Kind of hard to avoid stranger danger when your school bus driver can just be bullied into becoming an accessory to a kidnapping. But that's the kind of hold McElroy had on the people of Skidmore. Trenna gave birth to the pair's first child when she was only 14, at which point, according to court records, she tried to escape him and return home to her parents. But McElroy reportedly found her and took her right back to his house. Yeah, even Trenna's parents were too afraid to stand up to him. Not without reason. McElroy grew angry when Trenna's mother and stepfather refused to permit him to marry their underage daughter. So he allegedly returned to their home, killed their dog, and burned their house to the ground. He was indicted for statutory rape, arson, and assault, and Trenna and the baby were placed in a foster home. This only infuriated McElroy, who was seemingly emboldened by years of never being held accountable for his increasingly heinous deeds. He would sit outside the foster home and threaten to kidnap the family's biological daughter unless they let him take Trenna in what he described as a girl-for-girl exchange. McElroy was nothing if not a fan of blunt force abduction. According to Trenna's accounts, McElroy did finally succeed in marrying her in 1974, which allowed him to avoid any criminal charges for impregnating a minor. Because apparently you can do whatever you want to a child as long as you marry them afterwards? I don't get it. McElroy moved the young girl into the home he shared with his common-law wife, Alice. But even though he was legally married to Trenna, McElroy continued to father children with Alice. All told, the man had 11 children with 3 mothers. And although Trenna would later recant the story that led to McElroy's multiple indictments in an interview with People magazine after his murder, McElroy's predacious nature is a matter of public record. That's the drawback of doing all your crimes out in the open. You collect witnesses like Pogs. In another of his numerous criminal interactions with the people of Skidmore, McElroy allegedly shot a farmer named Romaine Henry in 1976. Henry claimed he confronted McElroy for firing guns on his property. Rather than leave, McElroy chose to fire at Henry instead. While waiting for his court date, McElroy repeatedly drove his pickup truck to Henry's farm to try to intimidate him into dropping the charges. But Henry stuck to his guns. Get it? Because of yeah, you get it. Unfortunately, Henry's courage in the face of the town bully didn't amount to much. When a trial was finally set, McElroy managed to find 2 raccoon hunters who claimed he was with them and not on Henry's property on the date in question. In the end, McElroy was acquitted. Let's take a moment to talk about Scentbird. Scentbird is a fragrance subscription service that gives you the opportunity to shop from over 600 brands that are now available in both the US and Canada. It's a flexible subscription so you can skip any month without penalties. Scentbird makes a sweet gift for the ones you love. One of the coolest things about it is how every month your recipient gets to pick what scents they want to receive, so there are no surprises. And while you're at it, why not treat yourself too? With Scentbird, you can get a decent amount of high-end fragrances for just $16. Some of the people here at Weird History tried it and were sent a variety of different fragrances. Maybe try that Roberto Cavalli. With a code, it will be only $7 for your first month. So make sure to use the coupon code for 55% off your first month at Scentbird. Throughout his life in Skidmore, McElroy was indicted a staggering 21 times for various offenses, all of which went largely unpunished for one reason or another. In cases where McElroy was arrested and charged, he would employ the same method he used against Henry and Trena's parents: coercion. As is probably obvious by now, McElroy was scary as hell. So scary that witnesses would typically refuse to testify. Lawyers would balk at prosecuting him, and judges were reluctant to incite his wrath. So the people of Skidmore endured McElroy and his illicit actions without any hope of a conviction sticking. That is, they did, right up until they didn't. The final straw came in 1980 when a store clerk accused McElroy's daughter of taking candy from the Skidmore town grocery, which was owned by 70-year-old Ernest Bo Bowenkamp and his wife Lois. When McElroy was confronted over the matter, his response, and we're totally serious here, was to offer Lois Bowenkamp money to fight his wife, Trena. Apparently, he was looking to kickstart a lucrative series of wife fight videos. The 80s. Lois did not go for it, and McElroy, a man with a documented history of holding grudges, began stalking the Bowenkamps outside of their store in his pickup truck with his gun in hand. The situation escalated until July of that year, when McElroy cornered Bowenkamp on the store's loading dock. Two young boys were watching, so McElroy gave them some money to go buy soda, eliminating any witnesses. Once the boys had cleared out, McElroy shot Bowenkamp in the neck. McElroy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. However, even though the case successfully went to trial, he was only convicted of the lesser crime of assault, and he was quickly released on bail pending appeal. As it would turn out, McElroy would have been better off staying in jail. This latest example of judicial wrangling made it seem like McElroy was going to find a way to escape punishment once again. But the people of Skidmore had had enough. A hearing to revoke McElroy's bond was scheduled for the morning of July 10, 1981, and the townsfolk decided to combine their efforts to protect the witnesses who were set to testify. McElroy, however, was able to get the hearing postponed, which was good for him, but infuriating to the town. Soon after being released, McElroy made an appearance at a local bar called the D&G Tavern, where he brandished a rifle and made explicit threats against Bowenkamp, describing what he planned to do in, shall we say, legally actionable detail. Several people who overheard him wondered if there was anything they could do to prevent McElroy from hurting people, and a local sheriff suggested they form a neighborhood watch. That's some mighty fine police work, Sheriff. Although, in fairness, it was obvious at this point that the legal system wasn't going to do anything about McElroy. A town meeting was held to discuss McElroy, although outside of the people who attended, no one knows for certain exactly what was discussed. It could have been a meeting to iron out the details of a community watch program, but it's also entirely plausible that the attendees were planning McElroy's murder. And honestly, it could have been both. Okay, everyone, the neighborhood watch has been formed. Let's see, item 1 on the agenda. Oh, shooting Ken Rex McElroy. On the day of McElroy's murder, he had returned to the D&G Tavern with Trena. At the same time, the townsfolk were meeting about McElroy at the local Legion Hall. When they heard he was back at the bar, they all headed over and packed the place out. Perhaps sensing something was about to go down, McElroy hurriedly finished his drinks, bought a six-pack, and headed back to his car. He climbed in his pickup truck with Trena, parked on the main street of Skidmore in broad daylight, when he was suddenly surrounded by a disgruntled group of over 30 town residents. As McElroy nonchalantly reached to light a cigarette, several shots were fired into the truck. Bullets struck him in the head and neck while Trena screamed in horror. No one attempted to assist McElroy, and no one called an ambulance. Ken Rex McElroy died at the scene. Police knew there had to have been more than one shooter. One shot had come from behind the truck and another from a block away. Additionally, shell casings from 2 different guns were found at the scene: a .22 caliber Magnum and an 8mm Mauser. Having multiple shooters at the scene of the crime may have been part of a deliberate effort to heighten confusion, making it difficult for authorities to pinpoint who was responsible. Or, considering McElroy's decades-long track record of being a wanton bastard, it may have just been a case of more than one person wanting to take a shot at him. With so many witnesses to the crime and at least 2 people pulling the trigger, County Prosecutor David Baird convened a grand jury, confident a suspect would be identified and detained. However, no suspect was ever named, and no arrests were ever made. The FBI even got involved and conducted over 100 interviews. but was unable to produce a single shred of evidence to tie anyone to McElroy's killing. The people of Skidmore simply refused to talk, so no indictments could be issued. McElroy's wife, Trenna, eventually accused a rancher and business owner named Del Clement for firing one of the fatal shots. But Clement never confessed, and the police never charged him with anything. A coroner's jury conducted an investigation, but ultimately they couldn't produce enough evidence tying Clement to the crime for an arrest warrant, and no one would corroborate Trenna's accusation. In 1984, Trenna filed a wrongful death suit against the county sheriff's office, the mayor, and Del Clement. Although she was seeking $6 million, the suit was settled out of court for just over $17,000, and no wrongdoing was ever admitted by any of the parties involved. In 1988, award-winning true crime author Harry N. McLean wrote a New York Times bestseller about the whole ordeal titled In Broad Daylight. The book chronicles McElroy's life, beginning as the 15th of 16 children, dropping out of school at age 15 and embarking on a life of crime that ended in a mysterious case of vigilante justice. In 1999, a film adaptation of the book was produced for television, starring Brian Dennehy as Len Rowan, a character very clearly based on McElroy. Meanwhile, Trenna, arguably the biggest victim of both McElroy and the town of Skidmore, eventually remarried, left Skidmore, and moved to Lebanon, Missouri, where she passed away in January of 2012 on her 55th birthday. On the BBC show Peaky Blinders, crime boss Tommy Shelby violently dominates the streets of Birmingham, England, while wearing tailored, fashionable clothes. But who were the real Peaky Blinders, and what made them the most feared gang in all of Britain? Well, today we're taking a look at the fascinating true story that inspired BBC's Peaky Blinders. Okay, time to take a peeky through these blinders. That's just fun to say. Must be why that show's such a hit. Birmingham was a booming, industrialized city by the second half of the 19th century. More like Boomingham, right? Am I right, you guys? Yeah, you'll come around. But this growth led to a wave of crime. Historian Philip Gooderson reported that by 1870, Birmingham's gangs had grown increasingly territorial, battling to claim different sections of the city. In fact, Gooderson's research showed gangs sometimes spend more time clashing over turf than committing offenses, because you can't set up a racketeering operation if you don't have a place to put all your racketeers. Surviving testimony from West Midlands Police Superintendent Spear confirms that in 1872, gangs of boys terrorized parts of Birmingham. Spear reported several weeks of complaints from Birmingham residents in Cheapside and Barford Street about crowds of boys who swept into the neighborhood, breaking windows and calling out insults. The Birmingham Daily Post also recorded that in 1872, a mob of boys threw brickbats and stones at the windows of general stores and confectioners. To clarify, a brickbat is a chunk of brick, and not nearly as cool as a bat made of brick. By 1895, these gangs were being referred to as Peaky Blinders. Children suffered from Birmingham's economic downturn just as much as adults, as poverty drove people into the slums indiscriminately. The Peaky Blinders emerged around 1880 as a crime wave swept across Britain, and they were only too happy to take advantage of the recruiting pool offered by destitute kids. And why not? Even Sherlock Holmes had a gang of kids on the payroll to do his dirty work. Records show that the West Midlands Police arrested 13-year-old David Taylor for carrying a gun, and gang member Charles Lambourne was only 12 when police arrested him in 1905. As surely as the gang didn't mind recruiting very young boys, they also had nothing against older men. For example, authorities arrested Peaky Blinders member Thomas Gilbert in 1904, when he was 38. The West Midlands Police took Gilbert's mugshot, recorded his missing finger and a scar on his knee as identifying characteristics, and listed his occupation as fishmonger. Sounds like a guy who sells bootleg concert CDs on eBay. The fishmonger. While law enforcement detained several other members of the gang for theft or breaking and entering, offenses that landed them in jail for up to 8 months, Gilbert faced charges for false pretenses. The charge implies Gilbert was tricking or defrauding victims, rather than engaging in the more violent acts of the younger gang members. So he wasn't a fishmonger. Man, you think you know a guy. But why were they called Peaky Blinders? What the hell does that even mean? And why would any serious criminal embrace such a silly-sounding name? Well, as is the case with most British slang, the phrase was much more serious than it sounded. To explain, take a look at the photographs taken by West Midlands Police depicting real members of the Peaky Blinders gang in their signature outfits. Consider the 1905 mugshot of Stephen McHickey. His cap, which had a hard brim, would have helped him and his fellow gang members commit crimes. According to historian David Cross, who is the curator of the West Midlands Police Museum and not the supporting star of Arrested Development, they used their hats with razor blades sewn in to rob people. That's what a Peaky Blinder was. This type of cap was referred to as a Peaky at the time. The men would headbutt their victims, doling out terrible cuts and causing temporary blindness, earning them the name Peaky Blinders. And that does sound better than stabby cappies or the slice hats. But just how accurate is that explanation? Historian Carl Chin has pointed out that the BBC show Peaky Blinders gets a few things wrong about the storied gang. First off, it's worth pointing out that while Cillian Murphy is a riveting leading man, there was no real Tommy Shelby. They just made him up for the show. Also, the leader of a London street gang named after a facial mutilation tactic probably wouldn't be quite as dreamy. Another thing the show gets wrong is the time period. The BBC drama is set in the 1920s, but in real life, the Peaky Blinders' heyday was in the 1890s. That's a swing of 30 years. That's like telling people World War II ended in 1975. The same year Jaws came out. And as for the idea that the Peaky Blinders sewed razor blades into their hats, Chin said it probably never happened. Oh man, that was the cool part of the story. Razor blades were still uncommon, expensive items in the 1890s, during the height of the Birmingham gang activity. It's unlikely a gang of street toughs would have had the ability or the inclination to arm themselves in such a complicated and costly manner, especially when an easily affordable knife would get the job done just as well. David Cross, the historian, not the TV star, counters that the stiff hats probably didn't need blades to be effective mugging tools. The gang members targeted victims who appeared to have money and headbutted them with their caps. The move caused the victims' eyes to tear up, making them temporarily blind. At that moment, the gang members took money or anything that they could sell quickly. Chin, however, believes the name Peaky Blinders was simply a reference to the gang's relatively elegant style of dress, and the whole blinding people with their hats thing is just a folk etymology. According to him, in the late 19th century, peaky referred to any flat cap with a peak, and blinder was Birmingham slang for something or someone of dapper appearance. In fact, that slang is still used in modern Birmingham. So really, the gang could have been named the Fancy Headbutters. We'll leave it to you to decide if you believe Cross or Chin, but there's nothing like a no-holds-barred historian fight to get the blood flowing, huh? One thing historians do agree on is that the Peaky Blinders wore recognizable outfits. Gang members wore silk scarves around their necks, sported thick wool jackets, and of course, topped it all off with the famous flat cap that was at least capable of hiding razor blades, whether or not they were ever really used for that purpose. Predicting the fashions of the 1970s by a good 80 years, the gang members also often donned bell-bottom pants and heavy boots, like Elton John going to work in a coal mine. Why all the fancy threads for a rough-and-tumble street gang? Well, according to historian David Cross, the gang chose its outfits to add class to their thieving, because presumably a victim would feel better about being robbed if they could at least see how their money was being spent. Clothes make the man, but they also make the woman. So the Peaky Blinders weren't the only ones who dressed up in Victorian Birmingham. Their girlfriends also followed the gang's lead by wearing expensive, tailored clothing. As historian Philip Gooderson relates, the girlfriends often wore pearls and imitated their boyfriends by wearing silk handkerchiefs. Unfortunately, the lavish outfits typically went hand in hand with physical abuse. As one woman said, he'll pinch and punch you every time he walks out with you. And if you speak to another chap, he don't mind kicking you. It's an important reminder that an idiot in fancy clothing is still just an idiot. The dapper gear also helped distinguish the Peaky Blinders from rival gangs, who we assume dressed like absolute trash. As surely as the Jets had to face off with the Sharks, and the Warriors had to do battle with the Gramercy Riffs, the Turnbull ACs, the Orphans, and the other 18 gangs crammed into that movie, the Peaky Blinders weren't the only group of ruffians in Victorian Birmingham. The streets were also home to the Sloggers, a rival gang dating back to 1870. The Sloggers allegedly took their name from their favorite weapon, which were large belts with buckles that could be used to beat victims. What is it with 19th century British gangs being named for weaponized articles of clothing? Also known as the Cheapside Slogging Gang, the Sloggers had plenty of their own brushes with the police. For example, according to an 1872 Birmingham Mail article, about 400 roughs brought indiscriminate violence to the Cheapside area, attacking and stealing. That sounds like a full-blown revolution, but the newspaper may have overstated the chaos. The article admits their authorities only arrested 3 people during the incident, 2 of whom were impoverished children. Sensationalism to sell news. Glad we don't do that anymore. The Peaky Blinders had a long rap sheet with the West Midlands Police. According to court reports, the Peaky Blinders were foul-mouthed young men who stalked the streets in drunken groups, insulting and mugging passers-by. Basically, they were a bunch of Dickensian street thugs on a perpetual bar crawl, regularly engaging in robbery, theft, and riots. Gang members carried knives, may have sewed razor blades in their hats, and beat enough people to earn the name sloggers, which, true to the conventions of British slang, sounds like it could either mean they were violent thugs or really great kissers. But the real Peaky Blinders weren't a single gang for their entire history. In Birmingham, some grouped multiple gangs, including the Brummagem Boys, the Netchell Sloggers, and Wainwright Street, under the title Peaky Blinders. It was basically a franchise. It's sort of like how every neighborhood has a McDonald's, except in this one, Ronald McDonald headbutts you and takes your wallet. In 1873, the Birmingham Daily Post wrote about a fight between two rival groups known as the Bradford Street Gang and Park Street Gang, and the clash was just the beginning. Within 2 years, the Allenson Street Slogging Gang had a new captain who led an attack against another gang leader named William Smallwood, aka Billy Smalls, aka WSMW, probably. The attack was meant to avenge Smallwood's vicious beating of two rival gang members, during which he severely injured the men's heads with a belt buckle. At his trial, Smallwood argued that his attack was self-defense, and the magistrate let him go. As the gangs continued to fight for territory, they directed much of their violence toward each other, rather than on other Birmingham residents, which we imagine was something of a relief to those residents. While gang warfare was certainly a reality in late 19th century Birmingham, much of the misdeeds attributed to the Peaky Blinders was petty crime and property damage, rather than the opening scene of Gangs of New York. Arrest records of Peaky Blinders made by the West Midlands Police more than a century ago detail some of those serious offenses. For example, law enforcement apprehended 19-year-old Harry Fowler for stealing a bike and trying to sell it. Ooh, scary. They also detained another member of the Peaky Blinders, Stephen McKickey, for breaking into a shop down the street from his house. It's not exactly the kind of stuff that earns you a star-studded series on the BBC. That's when you start making up stories about wearing razor hats. In truth, many gangs fought on the streets of Birmingham, including groups like White House Street, the Aston Sloggers, and the 10 Arches, any one of which would have also made a pretty badass name for a TV show. The lines between these gangs were sometimes blurry, since they frequently teamed up to take on rivals. In 1886, hundreds of gang members clashed in Rocky Lane, Birmingham. They fought with belts and bricks, requiring a full mobilization of the police to stop them. According to historian Carl Chin, many of these gangs eventually earned the nickname Peaky Blinders. By the 1890s, however, the city unveiled programs to civilize the working-class boys battling in the streets. By the early 20th century, gang activity in Birmingham had begun to decline, but we'll always have the BBC. John Lennon's murder is certainly one of pop culture's most shocking deaths. Any mention of the event is usually followed by the questions, who shot him and why did he do it? Of course, the death of a famous musician will always generate questions. But John Lennon's murder is still as confusing as it is disturbing, mostly because his murderer was a self-described fan. Today we're going to explore some of the more obscure facts about the murder of John Lennon that you might not know. Now, let's go back to New York City on Monday, December 8th, 1980, at the Dakota apartment building. Mark Chapman might have carried out the assassination of John Lennon on December 8th, 1980, but it wasn't his first attempt. According to his wife, Gloria Hiroko, Chapman attempted to take out Lennon 2 months earlier. In a 2018 interview, Hiroko said, 2 months earlier, Mark had traveled to New York. He came home scared, telling me that to make a name for himself, he had planned to kill Lennon. But he said my love had saved him. What happened was that Chapman flew out to New York a couple months earlier in October, but something changed his mind. He had an introspective moment. Chapman told his wife that he needed to grow up as an adult and husband, and needed time to think about his life. So why did Hiroko let Chapman go back to New York in December, knowing that just 2 months earlier, he admitted his previous plan to murder Lennon? In that same 2018 interview, Hiroko replied, "The only reason I was okay with Mark making another trip was because I had believed him when he said he needed to grow up as an adult and husband, and needed time to think about his life. He wanted me to sacrifice being alone for a short time so that we could have a long, happy marriage together. He said he threw the gun into the ocean, and I believed him. but he had lied to me. Hiroko later recalls the moment she discovered Lennon was shot. I remember it was a Monday. I had come home from work, fixed dinner, and was watching Little House on the Prairie. On the show, Mary had just found out she'd become blind when suddenly words ran across the bottom of the screen. John Lennon has been shot in New York City by a male Caucasian. My life changed dramatically that night. I was now Mrs. Mark David Chapman, the wife of a murderer. And not just any murderer, but one whose victim was known and loved by millions around the world. Incidentally, Hiroko is still married to Chapman. She refuses to divorce him.
Being a Beatles fan, I mourn the death of John Lennon and feel great sadness for his wife Yoko and his son Sean.
These days, the couple is allowed 44 hours a year for conjugal visits. Hiroko claims the two use their time to make pizzas and have sex.
Laurie, do you still love me?
Yes, very much, very much, very much.
Chapman was visiting New York City in from Hawaii for several days before he shot Lennon. On the day before he shot Lennon, Chapman encountered another famous musician in a train station, folk legend James Taylor. At the time, Taylor was living in a building near the Dakota and recalled hearing the sirens and commotion down 72nd Avenue. He also remembers his chance run-in with Chapman. His assassin had buttonholed me in the tube station. He pinned me to the wall, glistening with maniacal sweat, and tried to talk in some freak speech about what he was going to do. How John was interested and how he was going to get in touch with John Lennon. It was surreal to actually have contact with the guy 24 hours before he shot John. Of course, Lennon wasn't the only person that Chapman considered shooting. In a 3-issue interview with People magazine in 1987, Chapman admitted he had an alternate hit list of potential targets in mind, including Paul McCartney, Johnny Carson, Elizabeth Taylor, George C. Scott, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, Ronald Reagan, and Hawaii's Governor George Ariyoshi. But in 2010, Chapman stated that the only criterion for his list was being famous, and that he chose Lennon out of convenience. One has to wonder if Lennon's ease with fame and the access he allowed his fans put a target on his back. Chapman shooting Lennon wasn't their first interaction. After 2 days of stalking him, Chapman made contact with Lennon as he and his wife, Yoko Ono, were walking from the Dakota building to an awaiting limousine which was headed to the record plant recording studio 2 miles away. Although Lennon was on his way to the studio to put the final touches on Walking on Thin Ice, a song for Ono's next album, he took the time to sign autographs for several fans who had made the pilgrimage to the Dakota. One of those fans was Chapman. At approximately 5 p.m., Chapman held out a vinyl copy of Lennon's most recent release, Double Fantasy, and asked the singer for an autograph. Chapman recalls that interaction he had with Lennon when they made contact. He was very kind to me, ironically very kind, and was very patient with me. The limousine was waiting and he took his time with me, and he got the pen going and he signed my album. He asked me if I needed anything else. I said, no sir, and he walked away. Very cordial and decent man.
He's talking to a nobody, just sign an album for a nobody. And he's asking me, is that all I want? I mean, he's given me the autograph. I don't have a camera on me. What could I give him?
Approximately 5 hours and 50 minutes later, Chapman and Lennon would come in contact with each other one last time. A few hours before Chapman got Lennon's autograph, the singer curled up nude, almost in a fetal position, and wrapped himself around Yoko Ono. The iconic photo was taken by famed photographer Annie Leibovitz in the couple's Dakota apartment. Leibovitz was assigned to take a solo photo of Lennon for the cover of Rolling Stone, but the singer insisted that Ono was in the shot too. Leibovitz suggested the couple take off their clothes, but Ono balked at the idea, first agreeing to go topless, then dismissing the idea altogether. Instead, Lennon took everything off, wrapped himself around Ono, and Leibovitz got her shot. Later, she admitted Ono being clothed gave the image more weight. When Lennon saw Leibovitz's test Polaroids, he made her promise that the session made the magazine's cover. That evening, Lennon would be gone. Although Leibovitz felt that publishing the photo right after Lennon's death was exploitative, Rolling Stone published Leibovitz's photograph about 6 weeks later in its January 22nd issue. The photograph was later recreated in 2009 with Sean Lennon posing with his girlfriend Charlotte Kemp Mull with the roles reversed. We now know that Howard Cosell broke the news of Lennon's death during a live broadcast on Monday Night Football, but it almost didn't happen. Cosell was initially uncomfortable with the responsibility. Apparently, Cosell and Frank Gifford were doing play-by-play for a Monday Night Football pairing between the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots. With less than a minute left in the fourth quarter, the Pats were driving toward the goal line for the winning score. As the Patriots tried to put themselves in position for a field goal, Cosell got a phone call from ABC News president Roone Arledge. Arledge said his source confirmed Lennon had been murdered and that the news should be announced immediately. Cosell was unsure about the news break, thinking that a football game wasn't the appropriate forum for that kind of subject matter. While he wavered, Gifford, his partner in the broadcasting booth, convinced him otherwise, stating that the significance of the event was much greater than the finish of the game. Moments later, Cosell made the announcement.
Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news flash, which in duty bound we had to take. Frank?
So why did Chapman shoot Lennon? For a long time, Chapman gave investigators his Catcher in the Rye story. Chapman was obsessed with J.D. Salinger's book. He was so obsessed with this story, he saw himself as the living embodiment of Holden Caulfield, Salinger's angry protagonist. Fueled by the angst of Catcher in the Rye, Chapman felt that Lennon had become a phony, a label Holden Caulfield gave to people he encountered that he thought were superficial and insincere. Chapman admits he wasn't seething with rage over how he thought Lennon conformed from an outspoken rebel to a mainstream celebrity. Instead, he was very matter-of-fact about it, and he calmly and methodically began to plan Lennon's murder.
And I pulled the .38 revolver out of my pocket. I went into what's called a combat stance, and I fired at his back 5 steady shots.
Catcher in the Rye played such a large role in Chapman's initial excuse for killing Lennon, he even brought along a copy of the book when he met and killed the singer. Inside that book, Chapman wrote, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield. This is my statement."
Bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, signed it, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield," and wrote underneath that, "This is my statement," underlining the word "this," the emphasis on the word "this."
Initially, Chapman said he killed Lennon to make a point, to make a statement about the phonies of the world. But that story changed on his 8th parole hearing in 2014, when he said, "I am sorry for being such an idiot and choosing the wrong way for glory. I found my peace in Jesus. I know him. He loves me. He has forgiven me. He has helped in my life like you wouldn't believe." He went further during his 9th parole hearing in 2016 when he admitted that his actions were premeditated, selfish, and evil. Chapman was obsessed with Lennon and shot him for one reason only. He wanted a shortcut to fame, correctly assuming that his name would be remembered forever. Chapman later explained that he bore no ill will toward the singer. All he wanted was to be known for something. A parole board member once asked him, "It wasn't anything personal against John Lennon? It was just simply about you and gaining notoriety?" Chapman replied, "Absolutely true. Nothing personal." Chapman later made a statement intended for Ono, but also maybe for Lennon's fans. It wasn't anything against her husband as a person, only as a famous person. If he was less famous than 3 or 4 other people on the list, he wouldn't have been shot. And that's the truth. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. America and the world were stunned. The fallout of these events would have political, historical, and social implications that are still relevant today. However, those fatal shots were really just the beginning of the story. Today we're going to take a look at what happened immediately after JFK was assassinated. It was approximately 12:30 p.m. when the 3 shots were fired at the president's convertible Lincoln Continental. At the sound of the first shot, Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who was riding on the bumper of the follow-up car, left his position and ran towards the presidential limousine. His plan was to shield the president with his own body, but before he could get there, 2 more shots rang out. It was the 3rd and final shot that is believed to be the one that shattered the president's skull. After it struck, the president's wife, Jackie, panicked and tried to climb out of the passenger seat and onto the trunk of the car. It was at this point that Agent Hill was finally able to grab hold of the rear of the car. He climbed aboard and forced Jackie Kennedy back into the rear seat just as the automobile sped away. On the way to the Parkland hospital, Jackie spoke to her husband. In an interview, she would recall saying things like, "Jack, can you hear me? And I love you, Jack." For his part, Agent Hill would later claim that had he been stationed on the bumper of the president's car instead of the one behind, he would have gotten there in time to save JFK. After firing 3 shots at the motorcade from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald hid his rifle among some stacks of books. He descended a nearby stairwell and, 90 seconds later, encountered his supervisor and a Dallas policeman in a 2nd-floor lunchroom. As there was no reason to be suspicious of him yet, Oswald was allowed to go. 3 minutes after the shooting, just as authorities were beginning to seal off the area, Oswald left the building. He boarded a city bus, but the chaotic aftermath of the assassination had created traffic, so he quickly got off and hailed a taxi. He rode to his rooming house, which was located in the nearby area of Oak Cliff. The building's housekeeper observed him heading into his room and emerging only a few moments later wearing a jacket. About 15 minutes later, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, was having lunch thousands of miles away in suburban Virginia when the phone rang. It was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. "I have news for you," he said without a hint of emotion. "The president's been shot." Bobby tried to find out how bad the injury was, but Hoover would only tell him that he thought it was serious and he would make contact when he learned more. Then he hung up. At 12:38 p.m., the limousine arrived at Parkland Hospital, and President Kennedy was rushed into trauma room number 1. Chief Resident Ronald James and his team performed a tracheotomy, gave the president a chest massage, and inserted an IV into his arm. But it was too late. 12 minutes after he had entered the trauma room, JFK was pronounced dead. The president's body was placed in a hastily acquired coffin, which was loaded onto a gurney. However, when Jackie and the president's entourage attempted to take the body with them, they were confronted by Dallas County Medical Examiner Earl Rose. Rose insisted that Texas state law required an autopsy be performed in the county where the shooting occurred, which was technically correct. Jackie Kennedy, however, wanted to leave and wouldn't go without her husband's body. Rose refused to back down, and the situation grew tense. By some accounts, the Secret Service even drew their guns to force Rose out of their way. Whatever the truth is, the casket was whisked away to an airport at Love Field, loaded onto Air Force One, and flown out of the jurisdiction. Shortly after 1 p.m., Oswald left his rooming house and aimlessly wandered the neighborhood around his home. At 1:15, he reached the intersection of Patton and 10th Streets, where he encountered a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit. Witnesses reported that Oswald spoke to Tippit through the window of his car. The officer then got out of his vehicle and began walking towards Oswald, who then drew his gun and shot Tippit 4 times, including one to the head. What the two spoke about remains unknown. Tippit had received a description of the suspect in the Kennedy assassination, but there is no way of knowing if he had connected the description to Oswald. Regardless of the cause, the confrontation quickly brought a massive police presence to the area. Oswald behaved suspiciously and drew the attention of a shoe store employee named Johnny Brewer. Having heard the sirens in the neighborhood, Brewer decided to follow Oswald, who quickly ducked into a nearby movie theater without paying for a ticket. Brewer spoke to a theater employee, who then called the police. Dallas police descended on the theater. The movie was stopped, the house lights were raised. A patrolman named Nick McDonald patted down a few random patrons and finally made his way to Oswald. When McDonald asked him to stand up, Oswald shouted, "It's all over now." He then jumped at the officer, punching him with one hand while reaching for his gun with the other. Other officers converged on Oswald, and McDonald got the gun away from him. Lee Harvey Oswald was subdued, cuffed, and led out of the theater past an angry crowd that was already beginning to connect him to the assassination of the president. At 2:38 p.m. Central Time, Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a federal judge appointed by JFK only months earlier, swore in Lyndon Baines Johnson as the 36th President of the United States of America. This would be both the first and last time that the oath was administered by a female. Johnson, eager to show that the Kennedys supported the transition, insisted that Jackie stand next to him while he was sworn in. Air Force One arrived at Andrews Air Force Base at approximately 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The whole country watched live as the president's coffin was removed from the plane and loaded into an ambulance. Robert Kennedy, who had boarded the plane on its arrival, then emerged with Jackie. Finally, President Johnson exited the aircraft and briefly spoke to reporters.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed.
At this point, Jackie Kennedy was still wearing the famous pink outfit that she had on at the moment her husband was shot. JFK's dried blood was still clearly visible on her skirt. This was not an oversight. Earlier in the day, aides had asked Jackie if she wanted to change her clothes, but she refused, saying, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." On Friday night, Oswald was formally charged with the shooting of Officer Tippit. A few hours later, on Saturday morning, he was arraigned for the murder of John F. Kennedy. During an impromptu news conference, Lee Harvey Oswald told reporters, "The only thing I have done is carry a pistol in a movie. I didn't kill anybody. I haven't shot anybody. I'm just a patsy." Indeed, while Oswald's peculiar background as a Marine sharpshooter, former resident of the Soviet Union, and Marxist agitator created a cloud of suspicion around him, he maintained his innocence throughout his whole stay at the Dallas County Jail. On Sunday the 24th, President Kennedy's casket was brought to the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building by the same horse-drawn caisson that had previously transported the casket of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945. Accompanying it was a funeral procession that included the Kennedy family, members of the armed forces, and hundreds of government dignitaries and world leaders. Approximately 1 million people showed up to watch. For the next 24 hours, about 250,000 members of the general public were allowed to pay their respects. Despite freezing temperatures, the line to get in stretched over 2 miles. When the viewing concluded, thousands were still waiting and left unable to gain access. On Sunday the 24th, the Dallas police decided to transport Oswald from their downtown headquarters to another location at a county jail. While this was ostensibly done for Oswald's safety, it would, ironically, lead directly to his death. As Oswald was being led through the basement of the jail, he was shot by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. The shooting was broadcast live on television, which sent another shockwave through an already reeling nation. Oswald clung to life briefly, but then perished on the operating table at Parkland, the same hospital President Kennedy had died in only days earlier. While allegations of mob ties and criminal connections have caused Jack Ruby's behavior to be viewed with deep suspicion, there are also less conspiratorial explanations for his actions. Many believe that Ruby impulsively killed Oswald because he thought it would make him a hero. Supporters of this theory like to point to the fact that Ruby had been in the neighborhood to wire money to a dancer who worked for him. Based on the time of his wire, he would have required split-second coordination to get over to Oswald in time to shoot him. Moreover, Ruby had left his beloved Dachshund locked in his car when he sent the wire. It's hard to explain why Ruby would have brought his dog with him and then risked missing his chance to get Oswald by sending the wire if he were planning the shooting the whole time. Nonetheless, no one knows for sure. On November 25th, JFK's funeral mass was held at St. Matthew's Cathedral and attended by more than 1,200 invitees. At its conclusion, the casket was brought down the steps of the cathedral before the members of the Kennedy family. Considered too young to attend the burial, this would be the last time the children would see their father's casket. As it passed by, Jackie Kennedy whispered something into the ear of her son, John. Immediately, the boy snapped to attention and saluted his father's casket. This gesture would become a definitive visual moment of the 20th century. Yet it could not have been easy for the boy. It was his 3rd birthday. After the Mass, the casket was brought to Arlington National Cemetery in a procession that included the leaders of 99 different countries. While many believed Kennedy should be buried at his birthplace of Brookline, Massachusetts, a tour of Arlington caused Jackie to feel otherwise. She believed he belonged to the people, and ultimately selected to bury him in a prominent location on the slope in front of the Custis Lee Mansion.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. Let us pray.
During the funeral, an eternal flame was lit as a memorial to the fallen president. In the year following the burial, the grave was visited by an estimated 3,000 people an hour. By 3 years later, over 16 million people had come to pay their respects. On May 23, 1994, Jackie would be buried beside her husband at the same site. While JFK's funeral held the rapt attention of an entire nation, Lee Harvey Oswald's funeral was being hastily arranged in Fort Worth, Texas. In a brief ceremony attended by his wife, 2 young children, mother, and brother, the presidential assassin was laid to rest at the Rose Hill Cemetery. The funeral was also heavily attended by reporters, police, and federal agents. So few family members were there, reporters had to be reluctantly enlisted to be pallbearers. Oswald's rest has been anything but peaceful. In 1967, his gravestone was stolen as a prank, and in 1981, his body was exhumed at the request of his ex-wife, for the purposes of verifying he was actually in it. Conspiracy theorists had alleged someone else had been buried in the grave as part of a plot to cover up the assassination, but dental records and a childhood scar identified the body at the site as Lee Harvey Oswald. Throughout history, many societies have used tarring and feathering for both punishment and humiliation. The practice reaches as far back as the 12th century, and despite the fact that most people associate the ritual with the late 18th century, the last known instance occurred as recently as 1981. So, today we're going to take a look at the brutal history behind tarring and feathering. King Richard I of England, also known as Richard the Lionheart, was an exalted ruler who held the throne from 1189 until his death 10 years later. Considered a chivalrous king, he was well liked by his kingdom. He also developed a reputation as a great military leader, becoming a principal commander of the Third Crusade and even winning victories against the legendary Saladin. He was the first person to ever be documented as threatening to have someone tarred and feathered as a punishment. The relevant language comes from an order Richard gave his troops as they were headed to the Holy Land on a crusade in 1189. On the subject of thieves being discovered on his ships, the king declared that he shall first be shaved, then boiling pitch shall be poured upon his head, and a cushion of feathers shook over it, so that he may be publicly known. And at the first land where the ships put in, he shall be cast on shore. Well, that does sound like a cruel punishment. You have to admit, that man was an innovator. Whether they were really original to him or not, King Richard's ideas about the use of tarring and feathering as a punishment must have struck a chord with his people, because they were still using the process hundreds of years later. In 1623, a group of nuns and priests were subjected to the procedure. Since members of religious orders were highly esteemed in past centuries, they were punished severely for behaving outside of their prescribed boundaries. Although little is known about the incident itself, they were apparently tarred and feathered for public drunkenness, on the say-so of the Bishop of Halberstadt. Records show that in 1696, a London bailiff who was attempting to serve process on a debtor was tarred and feathered for his trouble. Tarring and feathering a debt collector? I think I get it. The English liked tarring and feathering so much, they brought it with them to the Americas, where it became a popular form of protest in the 18th century. Take the case of Captain William Smith, who was accused of ratting out smugglers to British customs authorities. Smith was hunted down by a Virginia mob who tarred and feathered him and then threw him in the harbor. And there are many such incidents. Why was tarring and feathering so popular in colonial times? Well, it was greatly a matter of convenience. The average American pillow was filled with feathers, and tar was also readily available, since pine tar was used as a common sealant in most shipyards. As the necessary materials were easily available to the average citizen, tarring and feathering quickly became a favorite method of punishment and humiliation among the colonists. This was especially true after the passing of the Stamp Act, when the colonists turned their outrage on British officials regularly. Another reason behind the widespread embrace of tarring and feathering was that, contrary to popular belief, it was not fatal. The survival rate was actually very high, even if the punishment itself was slow, brutal, and incredibly embarrassing. In fact, there is no record of a person dying from the punishment during the entire American colonial era. Today, when you hear tar, you probably think of asphalt. But in the times of the colonists, tar referred to pine tar, or resin, which is a glue-like material that was also known as pitch. Pine tar can be procured when pine wood is heated to extremely high temperatures in a low oxygen environment. This process turns the resin into a carbonized and incredibly sticky substance. Pine tar was widely used on wooden sailing ships as a sealant and wood preservative. Today, it's used in products like shampoo and skin treatments, and by professional baseball players. Pine tar is also the easiest phrase you can say to make Kansas City Royal George Brett angry. The assumption that tarring was an extremely hot and painful process stems from the modern association of tar with asphalt. In fact, asphalt must be heated to a much higher temperature than pine tar in order to reach a pliable state. The difference is about 300 degrees Fahrenheit versus 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The point being, pine tar would generally not cause any lasting damage from burns. That being said, it was hot enough to cause some damage. A judge named Peter Oliver once observed a man being tarred and feathered and said, "Hot pitch was poured upon him, which blistered his skin." Still, as hot as the pitch could get, the most lasting injuries were most likely tied to the victim's reputation and pride. The most common materials used globally for tarring and feathering were, in fact, pine tar and feathers. But when those eponymous ingredients were in short supply, Americans did what they do best. They got creative and began to use other materials they had readily on hand. Some common substitutes in the 1800s were syrup and cattails, which are both food products as opposed to building materials and stuffing. Being syruped and cattailed doesn't quite have the same ring to it as being tarred and feathered. But rhetorical aspects aside, they got the job done. History is replete with stories of people who win the lottery twice. But not everyone is so lucky. Take John Malcolm, a staunch British loyalist and comptroller for the Customs Service, who bore the distinction of being publicly tarred and feathered not just once, but twice. The first incident occurred in Maine in 1773 and became an integral element in Malcolm's local reputation. In this instance, he was being punished by a group of angry sailors. However, it wasn't as bad as it could have been because the attackers applied the tar and feathers over his clothes. The second tarring and feathering occurred in Boston in 1774. After Malcolm was stopped by a local man, George Hughes, for yelling at a boy. Malcolm struck Hughes down with his cane, and a mob soon gathered outside his home, outraged. Instead of caving to the mob, he egged them on, shouting, "You say I was tarred and feathered, and that it was not done in a proper manner? Damn you, let me see the man that dare do it better." Now, if you think daring an angry mob to do a better job at tarring and feathering you is a bad idea, then congratulations, you're smarter than John Malcolm. He was stripped to the waist, whipped, and beaten before being tarred and feathered for the second time in his life. He was then forced to drink tea until he puked, because, at that point, why not? His second punishment was so severe that his skin peeled off in chunks, which he saved in a box to show the king how much he had suffered. After the incident, Malcolm moved back to England, which, all things considered, seemed to make everybody happy. Born in 1830, religious leader Joseph Smith is most famous for being the founder of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement. In his mid-20s, he published the Book of Mormon, which he claimed he discovered written on gold plates in a language he called Reformed Egyptian. The publication attracted tens of thousands of people to his movement and kick-started what today is a global religion with millions of followers. So, where does the tarring and feathering come in? Well, in the middle of the night on March 24, 1832, Smith was dragged from his bed. Community members were angry about a few things. First off was his supposed plan to take land from them and place it under his own control. But perhaps the most pressing reason for the midnight kidnapping was the accusation that he had been intimate with a young girl in the community. It would feel good to praise the angry mob for their civic mindedness when it came to the protection of children. But during the events described, they also forced Smith's wife and baby from inside the house, and a few days later, the baby died from exposure. Smith was badly beaten and covered in tar and feathers. But apparently, the mob failed to make their point. Smith's friends spent the night cleaning him up, and the next morning, despite being wounded and weak, he still preached to his congregation. As previously mentioned, the popularity of tarring and feathering was largely a function of how easy it is to procure tar and feathers. It follows that when something so dangerous is so accessible, it's bound to fall into the hands of the worst kind of people. As such, one prominent example of tarring and feathering involved a high school principal from Willow Run School District, a town located 35 miles west of Detroit in Michigan. The town had a long history of racial tension, and in 1971, just 4 years after 43 people died in racial riots in nearby Detroit, Dr. R. Wiley Brownlee was kidnapped, tarred, and feathered by the KKK. What did Brownlee do to deserve such an attack? Well, he was a white man who was advocating the public recognition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. While this example is relatively recent, it's worth pointing out that the Klan had historically used this punishment on African Americans. All good things must come to an end, and all bad things usually peter out eventually too. Tarring and feathering had a good long run that lasted centuries, but it now seems to have gone the way of the dodo. The last recorded instance of this fairly horrifying phenomenon happened to one Elizabeth Jamieson, who was tarred and feathered on her wedding day in 1981. The ex-wife of her husband-to-be, Marietta McElway, was angry that Jamieson was proceeding with the wedding in spite of McElway's threats. McElway and her sister essentially held Jamieson at gunpoint before chopping off her long hair, stripping her torso, and tarring and feathering her from the waist up. While the attack was no doubt pretty terrifying, it did not succeed in its goal. Determined to carry on with her wedding plans, Jamieson recovered from the incident and went forward with the wedding, wearing a short wig to hide her butchered hair and hopefully a good amount of perfume to mask the tar stench. Good for her. We hope it worked out and she got some really great wedding gifts. In August of 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo began an investigation into the power dynamics that exist between guards and inmates in a prison setting. The object of the Stanford Prison experiment was to determine if it was the acquisition of power that made guards turn brutal, or whether brutality was actually intrinsic to human nature itself. The notorious experiment that ensued would kick off decades of academic controversy and suggest some very dark things about the nature of humanity. Today, we're going to take a look at why the Stanford Prison experiment might be the most disturbing study ever conducted. During the 1970s, both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were interested in learning about the hierarchies of power in military prisons. Accordingly, the U.S. Office of Naval Research issued Philip Zimbardo a grant to study the relationships between prison guards and prisoners. The objective would be to determine if those relationships were shaped more by the prison environment or the personalities of the guards. The grant would be used to create a mock prison environment in which to conduct the experiment and to pay the participants. The Stanford Prison experiment started with an ad Zimbardo placed in the classifieds. It read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 70 people applied. The applicants were interviewed and asked to take personality tests. Anyone who had a criminal record or record of abusing narcotics was eliminated, as was anyone who displayed personality disorders, physical disabilities, or psychological problems. Ultimately, 24 college students, all white and all male, were selected to participate. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into." Zimbardo and his team randomly divided the students into 2 groups, prisoners and guards. There were 12 of each category, 9 that were active participants and 3 that were alternates. On August 17, 1971, the experiment began when the 9 prisoners were arrested by actual police officers from the Palo Alto Police Department. Each person was taken into custody, then had their mugshots taken before being fingerprinted, blindfolded, and moved into a holding cell. Finally, they were taken into a mock prison that had been set up in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall. The fake prison felt very real. The researchers who created it had consulted with prison officials and ex-convicts before designing it. The cells were built in a space that was normally used as a laboratory. Each cell had a barred door, a cell number, and room for 3 prisoners. Other touches included a solitary confinement cell that had been created in a closet, and a rule that prisoners had to be blindfolded before being taken to the bathroom. To avoid selection bias, participants were assigned to be either prisoners or guards based on the results of a coin toss. Very different fates awaited each respective group. Guards were given real prison guard uniforms, complete with nightsticks and whistles. Many guards even donned mirrored sunglasses, which were meant to prevent eye contact with the prisoners, or maybe just to look like Boss Godfrey from Cool Hand Luke. Prisoners, on the other hand, were stripped, deloused, and dressed in sandals and an ill-fitting numbered smock. They weren't issued any underwear, but they were given nylon stocking caps, which they were asked to wear in lieu of having their heads shaved. Once dressed, a chain was placed on each of their legs. Prisoners were only addressed by their number and had to refer to themselves and the other prisoners in the same way. It was a recipe for dehumanization and oppression. Zimbardo himself served as superintendent of the prison, and researcher David Jaffe played the warden. The two were responsible for instructing the guards and laying down the scope of their duties. First and foremost, the guards were told to maintain order. To this end, they were allowed to use any means necessary, short of physical violence. Things that were permitted included harassment, the withholding of food, and the deprivation of privileges at the guards' discretion. The guards, unlike the prisoners, were also allowed to work in shifts. The shifts, which each required 3 guards, lasted 8 hours. Off-duty guards didn't have to be at the prison, but were asked to remain on call in case of an emergency. On the first night, the guards decided to use a whistle to rouse the prisoners from their sleep for a head count at 2:30 a.m. Some of the prisoners didn't take the head count seriously, and the guards punished them by making them do push-ups. After a head count, the prisoners had already had enough and decided to rebel. On what was only the second morning of the experiment, they removed the numbers from their uniforms, pulled off their stocking caps, and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. When the next shift of guards arrived in the morning, they were alarmed to find the prisoners yelling curses at them from their cells. They requested reinforcements and made plans to quell the uprising. They brought in the on-call guards, and the night shift volunteered to do extra duty. It was only day 2, and things were already getting ugly. In order to get the cell doors open, the guards used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the barricades. Once that was accomplished, they rushed into the cell, grabbed the prisoner, and stripped them naked as a jaybird. The birthday suit prisoner was then placed into solitary confinement. While they were there, the guards would remove the bed from their cell, meaning the prisoner would have to sleep on the floor when they returned. Once the rebellion was controlled, the guards had to figure out how to prevent another from happening without having to have all 9 guards perpetually on duty. The solution was to divide and conquer. The guards deemed one of the cells the privilege cell. Well-behaved prisoners were placed in the privilege cell, where they would get their uniforms and beds back and even get special meals. The other prisoners were not only denied of all these things, but were deprived of their normal food rations. After a few hours, the guards would randomly move the prisoners around. The idea was to create confusion and sow the seeds of distrust among the inmates. And it worked. In the wake of the uprising, conditions deteriorated fast. The guards started making a point of dehumanizing the prisoners by making them call out their identification numbers. Prisoners were also forbidden from using the bathroom at night and were forced to use a bucket in their cell instead. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets, reasoning that the bad smell was simply another punishment for misbehavior. Despite what Zimbardo described as frequent reminders from the staff, the guards grew increasingly aggressive. The most egregious behavior occurred when the staff wasn't paying attention, which became stressful and frustrating for the prisoners. The prisoners, as a result, became increasingly submissive, and the experiment was about to claim its first victim. After only 36 hours, prisoner Doug Corpy began suffering from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. The guards used this opportunity to try and coax him into becoming a snitch, but when his erratic behavior continued, the staff realized Doug was in genuine distress and needed to be released from the experiment. On the 6th day, Zimbardo convened a mock parole board, which was headed by one of the experiment's prison consultants. Inmates who believed they deserved parole would be allowed to present their case to the board. It was during these presentations that Zimbardo, along with the other researchers, began to theorize that the prisoners no longer saw themselves as participants in an experiment, but as real prisoners. According to Zimbardo, the prisoners had internalized their crimes, as well as their roles as inmates. As for the guards, he came to identify 3 different types. Tough but fair guards, who followed prison rules. Good guys, who did little favors for the prisoners and never punished them. And finally, guards who appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power they wielded. Zimbardo felt this last group was hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation. Zimbardo concluded that most people were ultimately willing to fulfill whatever role they were given in a respective social setting. He even admitted that he had internalized his role as superintendent over his role as a psychologist. At one point, Zimbardo brought in a real priest to talk with the prisoners. It was during this conversation that prisoner 819 broke down sobbing. He was so hysterical that the staff agreed to take him to a doctor. The other inmates, for their part, turned on 819. Researchers offered to send him home, but 819 surprisingly refused, saying that he couldn't leave because the other inmates had labeled him a bad prisoner. Zimbardo was forced to intervene. Pulling the student aside, he forcefully reminded him that he was not really an inmate and that the experiment was not really a prison. The prisoner is alleged to have stopped crying and looked at Zimbardo like a small child awakened from a nightmare. After that, 819 agreed to leave. On the sixth day, a recent PhD recipient named Christina Maslach was brought in to interview the prisoners. Horrified by what she saw, she confronted Zimbardo, asking him how he could see what she had seen and not care about the students who were suffering. According to Zimbardo, he quickly realized she was right. It was at that moment that he decided to prematurely end the study. Later, he would reflect on his own behavior and claim that it wasn't until his discussion with Maslach that he realized how deeply he had internalized his role at the prison. Ultimately, he concluded he was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist. Both the ethics and conclusions of the Stanford Prison experiment remain highly controversial. Its scientific rigor has been repeatedly questioned by scientists who have been unable to duplicate its results. And even Zimbardo himself has admitted the whole thing was more of a demonstration than a scientific experiment. A 2018 book by French academic Thibault Letixier dismissed the entire thing as nonsense. He argued that the guards had been told what results they were supposed to produce and were advised and guided by Zimbardo and his staff the whole way through. The Yakuza are much more than just an underground criminal organization like the Mafia or a radical video game franchise. Their history goes back centuries, and while their influence has ebbed and flowed, one thing that has remained constant is the Yakuza's enduring adaptability. So, today we're going to take a look at the surprising history of the Yakuza, or the Yakuza. Time to count all your fingers and strap in for a quick tour of the Japanese criminal underworld. The origins of the Yakuza name tell the story of the foundations of the group itself. Comprising of three separate parts, Ya, Ku, and Za, Yakuza translates to good for nothing or born to lose. The name is basically a Springsteen song. When you split it up, however, it becomes 893, the name of a losing hand in a popular card game called Hanafuda, which is comparable to blackjack. The Yakuza grew out of a gambling and peddling culture in Japan tracing back to the 18th century, but they see themselves as based in a much older tradition. Yakuza members consider themselves to be part of a Ninkyo Dantai, or chivalrous organization, with links to the earliest days of the Muromachi and Edo periods. The Muromachi period, which lasted from 1138 to 1573 CE, and the Edo, or Tokugawa period, which lasted from 1603 to 1867 CE, was home to Ronin, wandering samurai without lords. Ronin, like Ishikawa Goemon, were outsiders who stole from the rich, gave back to the poor, and avenged wrongdoing in Japan. And while that certainly sounds like something to aspire to, in reality, the only thing the Yakuza really gives back to the community is racketeering and extortion, and there's no gift receipt, so good luck returning it. Still, the image is appealing to plenty of people. At its peak in 1963, the Yakuza had roughly 183,000 members. Because data about crime syndicates in Japan wasn't available before 1958, the numbers prior to this peak are unknown. The Yakuza was at the height of its power in the mid-20th century, thanks in part to the CIA and its relationship with Yoshio Kodama. Kodama was a political revolutionary prior to World War II and operated in China as a Japanese spy throughout the conflict. Along with collecting information for Japan, Kodama accumulated wealth through a network of back-channel operations, violent acts, and connections with the Japanese underworld. It was like sending Tony Soprano to infiltrate an enemy nation. According to a CIA report, Kodama was blood brother to a number of the Yakuza. But that didn't stop the agency from enlisting him to serve as a contact in Asia during the late 1940s. The CIA also funded the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, a political group within which Kodama exhibited immense power and influence. With the CIA and the Yakuza on his side, he became an extremely influential undercover man in conservative and financial circles by the 1960s. As an intermediary between the Japanese underworld and legitimate authorities, Kodama developed a reputation akin to a mafia godfather. During the mid-1970s, however, a scandal involving Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, Kodama, and the Japanese government brought the Yakuza powerhouse under scrutiny. He was indicted for tax evasion and violating international exchange laws, but he died in 1984 before any verdict was issued. That's one way to beat a rap. That man was a master strategist. The Yakuza is a patriarchal organization that mirrors Japanese society as a whole. In it, the Oyabun is the boss as well as a parental figure. Under the Oyabun are the Kobun, apprentices who are essentially seen as children. The Oyabun-Kobun relationships binds all Yakuza members and includes specific responsibilities. However, unlike most parent-child relationships, these responsibilities are less doing the dishes and more destroying your father's enemies. The Oyabun mentors his Kobun to kill others or even kill themselves for the sake of the Oyabun, which is slightly more extreme than what fathers tell their kids when the neighbors return the lawnmower with an empty gas tank, but only slightly. According to one former Yakuza Kobun, when you're a Yakuza, people are always watching you. Think of yourself as being on stage all the time. It's a performance. If you're bad at playing the role of a Yakuza, then you're a bad Yakuza. This performance has strict rules. One of the most important rules for members is to keep their tattoos private, like a college freshman coming home for winter break. This is done mostly out of respect, because Japanese culture generally frowns on tattooing. Members of the Yakuza get tattoos to demonstrate their loyalty as well as their ability to withstand pain. Once associated with punishment, the tattoos attest to a tradition dating to the 3rd century that holds men both great and small tattoo their faces and work designs upon their bodies. Yakuza tattoos take years to complete, cost thousands of dollars, and are on areas of the body that one wouldn't expose to the public. Even those places. Another act of body modification practiced by Yakuza members is called pearling, which involves inserting small beads or pearls under the skin of your genitalia, with each bead or pearl representing a year in prison. Yeah, that's cool, guys, but I think I'll try to stay out of prison. One of the most notorious and cringe-inducing practices associated with the Yakuza is yubitsume, or finger shortening. It began as a punishment used by Japanese gamblers, known as bakuto. Yubitsume was performed when a serious offense had taken place, but not quite serious enough for banishment or execution. It was designed to weaken one's hand, essentially making the offender more dependent upon his boss. Yubitsume commonly involves the self-amputation of the top joint on one's pinky finger. It's intended to be an apology in lieu of words, because nothing says I'm sorry like chopping off your own pinky. Most Yakuza members are too proud to outright apologize or beg for forgiveness, to the point that yubitsume is the preferred option. Evidence suggests that the practice of yubitsume is not as common as it once was. But in 1993, data indicated 45% of Yakuza members had lost at least one finger. Out of those, 15% undertook the ritual 2 times or more. At that point, I'm guessing the problem is you, not the yubitsume. And because sometimes yubitsume just isn't enough, there's also shuniyubi, which entails the loss of an entire finger to preempt a more severe punishment. For 6 years, French photographer Chloe Jaffe documented the lives of women married to members of the Yakuza. However, before she could start, she had to get permission from a Yakuza boss. That step alone might have scared off most people. Going straight to an underworld kingpin and asking him if you can photograph his operation might end with you at the bottom of a reservoir, and a whole bunch of people saying, "I told you so." But the boss was impressed by Jaffe's determination and slowly opened his doors to her. Jaffe soon discovered that while women can't officially become Yakuza themselves, a woman who has married a member of the Yakuza is absolutely part of the group. She explains that Yakuza wives live like most housewives in Japan, but their specific attachments to their husband's connections depend on his status in the organization. For instance, leaders' wives serve as consultants and manage finances, although usually through an intermediary. Women also get tattoos comparable to Yakuza members, but according to Jaffe, they are more like armors, omamori in Japanese. They are protections. The women are also bound by similar rules. They keep their tattoos hidden, and once they are connected with the organization, they find it very difficult to leave. Michael Corleone had it right. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. Shoko Tendo, the daughter of a Yakuza member, admitted that, while she hated the way my father behaved, I became just like him. Violence, drugs, and turmoil defined her early life. But looking back, she would later say she wouldn't have lived any other way. The largest Yakuza subset is the Yamaguchi-gumi. In 2015, roughly 100 years after it was established, the Yamaguchi-gumi organization fractured into two separate groups. The offshoot, Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi, formed its own organization, although it later split into three smaller groups. The main outcome of this initial split was a violent civil war that has lasted more than 5 years. Authorities in Japan established an entire agency to try to quell the violence that erupted during the Yamaguchi-gumi War. Similar to how the FBI was established to deal with the growing organized crime problem in the U.S. Officers patrolled near schools, arrested members of both groups en masse, and monitored the rebellion faction's headquarters in Kobe, but were unable to prevent assassinations and violence. Despite years of fighting, members of the two groups appeared to make amends in 2021, signaling what may be the end of the war. Fingers crossed. Except for, those who have done yubitsume. The sake ritual is a ceremonial exchange between kobun and their oyabun. A full sake ceremony includes a mix of fish, salt, and sake, along with a kobun, oyabun, and intermediaries called azukarinin. With the kobun and oyabun facing each other while sitting at a Shinto shrine, they exchange sake cups and recite their duties to each other in a formal pledge. The sake symbolizes blood and establishes lifelong bonds. But from the perspective of Satoru Takagaki, a former Yamaguchi-gumi boss, the civil war within the organization has fundamentally changed the Yakuza. According to him, when the Yamaguchi-gumi split apart, the Yakuza world had to reassess the meaning and importance of the bonds cemented by ritual sake drinking. Takagaki felt that when you ignore the precepts and rationale of the Yakuza world, you call into question the entire structure of the society. This is why no respectable Yakuza organization bonded with Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi. He believed that if one drank the sake and later became disenchanted with that oath of loyalty, then he should just leave the group and go straight. To put it another way, if you don't have the stomach to honor the pledge, then don't drink the sake. Oh boy, that wouldn't be the first time we shouldn't have drunk the sake. The Yakuza have taken steps over the years to try and soften their public image. As early as the 1960s, Yamaguchi-gumi leadership tasked the organization with combating amphetamine use. In 2014, Yamaguchi-gumi launched a website to help purify the nation as part of its ongoing Drug Expulsion of Land Purification Alliance initiative. The website put forward anti-drug messaging alongside a theme song that included the lyrics, "With nothing but my courage and this body, I trust myself to the life of a Yakuza and follow this path I've decided on. In Nagoya, the Yamaguchi-gumi emblem is our life, dedicated to chivalry. That's the spirit of a man." We're not kidding. They really wrote a song. This toe-tapping jam was intended to emphasize masculinity and self-discipline, while downplaying the many crimes in which Yakuza members have been involved. According to journalist and Yakuza expert Jake Adelstein, the point of the website is to demonstrate that the Yamaguchi-gumi is actually a humanitarian organization. The Yakuza also publishes its own magazines. When it debuted in 2013, Yamaguchi-gumi Shinpo was a magazine with only 8 pages. Proving that literally every organization on Earth has a newsletter, it was printed for the roughly 27,000 members of the Yamaguchi-gumi group within the Yakuza, intended to communicate goals and policies from the top down. The publication included poetry and games, an essay by Yamaguchi-gumi boss Kiyoshi Takayama, and a story about fishing. It's like a highlights magazine for tattooed gangsters with missing fingers. According to Adelstein, the magazine is the Yamaguchi-gumi's attempt to show the public that it's an old organization that upholds traditional Japanese values, that its members are not a bunch of violent thugs. This was not the first publication of this type issued by the Yakuza. From 1965 to 1975, Yamaguchi-gumi Jiho was in print, similarly distributed among thousands of its namesake's members. Yakuza membership has been on a decline since the early 2000s. Japan's National Police Agency estimated roughly 26,000 full-time and associate members at the end of 2019. That's just 14% of the numbers the Yakuza had in its ranks during its mid-20th century peak. The world has not seen a steeper membership drop since the Kirk Cameron fan club. And in 2020, the group saw lower numbers for the 16th year in a row. However, as Adelstein noted in 2017, they aren't just vanishing, they're transforming. One former Yakuza boss explained, "The Yakuza are a franchise. You pay your association dues to borrow the power and menace of the group. Fear makes people pay you. But if you can't use the name or the symbol, why even stay? It's like running a McDonald's without being able to use the golden arches. Better to cut expenses and leave. We're not vanishing. We're restructuring." That sounds like a quote from the CEO of MoviePass. And while there's something appealing about a fearsome criminal organization adopting the corporate jargon of an imploding tech startup, unfortunately for the Yakuza, their restructuring has been negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, with numerous businesses no longer to pay mikaji merio, or protection money. They're presumably placing a temporary hold on all leg breakings until these business owners can get back on their feet. So what do you think? Which of these facts about the Yakuza surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.